Hello, and welcome to our webinar, The Road Ahead, Ending Broken Windows Policing. I'm India Tusi, Associate Counsel at the Opportunity Agenda, and I'll be moderating today's webinar. The Opportunity Agenda is a social justice communication lab. We work with partners to move hearts and minds towards lasting policy and culture change. Today's webinar is the second in a series of 3 about the road ahead for social justice. Today, we're very glad to be joined by 3 of our partners, Nusrat Chaudhary of the ACLU, Melissa Brodo of the Sex Workers Project, and former Communications Institute Fellow, Janae Bantu of BYP 100. We're also joined by our very own, Julie Fisher-Rao. We're going to be talking about how social justice community can expand how we think about making our community safe for everyone by ending broken windows policing. The speakers will provide a short introduction about their work and how they are working to end broken windows policing. We'll then have a conversation about some of the current challenges, and we'll end by taking questions at the end of the presentation. So feel free to enter any questions you have into the questions function on your GoToWebinar panel. You can also tweet questions to me at Indri on Twitter. We'll attempt to answer as many questions as you can. Feel free to join the conversation online by using the hashtag UnbreakableCJ or by tweeting OpAgenda. After the webinar concludes today, a short evaluation will pop up on your screen. Please do take the time to fill that out so we can improve future webinars based on your feedback. You'll also be receiving a follow-up email with a few different materials from today's webinar, including a recording of the presentation, which you should feel free to share with anyone in your networks. Our speakers today are fighting to make sure that our communities are safe spaces for everyone. They each work with communities that have been affected by broken windows policing, and they each will share their insights on how you can create a narrative about community safety that ensures that no one is left behind or subject to profiling, harassment, or worse. The theory behind broken windows policing was popularized by 2 researchers in an Atlantic Monthly piece that theorized that police should focus on minor offenses. Instead, broken windows policing has been used as a tool for profiling and discriminating against whole segments of our population and our communities. The way that our speakers today have worked on the issues around broken windows policing reflects a real commitment to intersectionality and highlights why it's important to think about this issue in an intersectional way. So with that, we're going to get started. A big thank you for joining us today, and a special thank you again to each of our speakers. First up is Melissa Brodo.
Hi, thank you so much for having me here today. It's a great group to be part of, so I really appreciate it. And I'll just talk for a few minutes about how broken windows policing impacts sex workers and survivors of human trafficking, which are the communities that we work with at the Sex Workers Project. And I'm hoping everyone can hear me okay. So it was very interesting when I was preparing for this. I was reading up about broken windows, the history of broken windows policing, and what I thought was so interesting that George Kelling, one of the criminologists who came up with this theory, he properly diagnosed a pretty big problem, right, in the sense that communities that are in obvious disrepair, often there's issues where people don't feel that they're being taken care of or they're being protected or cared for, and people are maybe more likely to commit offenses because it's sort of, there is this chaos and disorder, right, in their communities. And I think that idea is not a bad or wrong idea, but the problem is the solutions that the police took from this theory. And it's interesting because I found an article where George Kelling sort of said he never wanted it to go in this direction. So I actually thought that was very interesting. It was never his intention that it would lead to, that his theory would lead to police arresting people for all sorts of minor offenses. So that leads me to how does that sort of intersect or impact with sex workers and survivors of trafficking? Well, very interestingly, there's a really strong parallel, I would argue, between this ideological disconnect that we see with broken windows, right, where there might be diagnosing a problem or an issue, but coming up with completely the wrong solution. And I definitely see this in the world of human trafficking. You know, we've all sort of diagnosed a problem, human trafficking, right? Anything with force, fraud, or coercion. I think everyone can agree that that's not something that we would support and that we want to stop. But where we diverge is on how to end it. And, you know, so just I think there's a very strong parallel there. Those of us that are amongst the sex worker rights movement that have a human rights and harm reduction based model would very strongly argue that decriminalization is the way to go and ensures bodily autonomy, access to rights, but law enforcement sort of sees, oh, there's people being harmed and trafficked, let's arrest more people, right? And of course, the irony, in a way, is with broken windows policing, the people that are more arrested and targeted are the people that are most vulnerable, right? So sex workers, specifically queer and trans sex workers of color. And that's sort of what I want to speak to. I know I only have about 2 more minutes, but you know, where does that leave sex workers, right? When we have this theory of broken window, we have the practice of broken windows policing, not the theory, the practice. Certainly very, very worse off, right? Because we are dealing with people that are at the intersection of so many marginalized identities, right? So sex worker, you know, whether queer, trans, people of color, youth, might be homeless youth. And so then because of broken windows, they're put in this position where there are heightened arrests for these minor offenses, including prostitution, but also disorderly conduct, loitering for the purpose of engaging prostitution, being a public nuisance, etc. So I just want to very quickly, I know I don't have a ton of time, talk about particular trends that are happening, you know, as a result of this, or sort of intersecting with broken windows. So the first is the closing of Backpage and Craigslist. And just to give people an incredibly brief history, you know, these websites that sex workers rely on to safely meet with book clients, reliable clients, are being shut down because, again, of this misdirected solution around human trafficking. Let's shut everything down, let's arrest everybody. So Backpage has closed its adult services, and so is Craigslist. And so what does that mean? That means that people who are in the most dire financial situation, who are engaging in sex work, are going to have to use other means. Obviously, other websites are going to be popping up and other searches within Craigslist and Backpage, of course. But you know, the people that are most desperate need of money, they will be forced to meet people in the street or in clubs where they're going to be more at risk for these low-level broken windows types offenses. And the second thing, and I know I only have like 30 seconds left, is violence against trans women of color and immigrant sex workers. And I just want to bring up, right, in the age of Trump, you know, highlight the issue around immigrant sex workers as being especially vulnerable, right, already to broken windows policing, of being stopped when they leave their house, especially trans immigrant sex workers, right? Everybody's probably heard of walking while trans. Well, now that's compounded by all these immigration fears, right? So if somebody's arrested for a very minor offense, that could trigger deportation. And so that's a very that's always been a concern of our clients, but that is incredibly more heightened under Trump. And so I'll just take the last couple of seconds. So where do we go? And I know we'll talk about solutions, but you know, I would just say in the age of alternative facts, it's important for those of us in this movement to keep ensuring that the facts stay out there, as hard as that is. And you know, to do info sharing, remain intersectional, think about how we can collaborate and work together. And lastly, for those of us that do client work, really continuing to ensure that our clients know that we support them, that not all lawyers and social workers and other people in authority positions are out to hurt them or place them in difficult situations, that we are there hopefully to provide support and sanctuary in some way. So thank you so much. Sorry for going a little over my time.
Thank you so much for your remarks, Melissa. Next up we have Nusrat Chaudhary from the ACLU.
Hi everyone, sorry I had a little trouble with the unmute button. Thanks so much for having me. I think this is such an important conversation at a truly critically important time, because the way that India has helped us frame this conversation is about a strategy, a policing strategy that was started years ago and appears to have gone on the ground in its implementation terribly wrong, based on both the lived experiences of people in communities that are being subjected to broken windows policing, and when you look at the numbers and the data that's coming out about how police encounters with civilians are unfortunately leading to widespread racial profiling in many places where this strategy has been embraced in certain forms. So to step back for a second, for the last 10 years, we've heard about broken windows policing being used in cities across the country, in places like New York, like Boston, like the city of Milwaukee. And in each of the places where it's used, we hear stories from people on the ground, everyday, normal people, black and brown, saying that they're being harassed by police, subjected to stops, often also frisks and searches, when engaging in routine behavior that everyone does, like walking home from school, walking to work, driving to visit family and friends. And what we've seen in cities like New York, Boston, and Milwaukee are communities actually rising and saying what we're experiencing on the ground is not a targeted crime control strategy, but actually harassment for the way that we look and how we appear when we're doing things that everybody engages in. And so just to give some context to this, the ACLU and many community organizations have worked together in cities like Boston to do a report in 2014 on stop and frisk policing, largely founded on a broken windows theory of policing in that city, that told the stories of young people who were being stopped, some people dozens of times, teenagers in their own neighborhoods, and also showing how data on police encounters during a 4-year period in that city showed that race was actually influencing who was stopped and the number of stops, as well as who was likely to be stopped multiple times, or who was likely to be frisked after a stop had been started. And those kinds of reports have really raised awareness and understanding, showing that when communities are speaking out against certain policing strategies, including broken windows policing, they aren't crying wolf. There's actually data to back them up. In the city of Milwaukee, communities have been expressing concern over policing strategies for years. This is a city where every few years there is a tragic and terrible killing of an unarmed black person by police officers. Most recently in 2014, Dontre Hamilton, and last summer, a killing in August that led to protests and expressive concern by communities across the city, as many people heard and read in the media. This last fall, the ACLU, our partners, filed a lawsuit challenging stop and frisk for leading to widespread racial profiling and unconstitutional, unlawful stops of black and Latino people. And this is a lawsuit that gives voice to the concerns of this community, that the Milwaukee Police Department is running a vast stop and frisk program that targets people without reasonable suspicion and based on racial profiling in violation of their rights. And to give some explanation of why the communities are so concerned about this, it really takes no more than looking at the story of one plaintiff in that case, and that's Tracy Adams, the mother of a teenager who's been illegally stopped by police at least 3 times, and that first unlawful stop took place when her son was only 11 years old. He was stopped and frisked at the age of 11 when he arrived at his friend's house in the middle of the day for a play date. He was literally at his friend's door, waiting to go inside, waiting to be let in, when a police car rolled up and an officer stopped and frisked him. When a child is stopped and frisked, when a black child has that experience at the age of 11 years old, it tells us that something is wrong. And what we see in the records in Milwaukee is that in about 2008, the police department embraced broken windows policing, and that strategy has gone tragically awry. I'll stop by saying that this kind of policing has actually formed the basis for very powerful coalition building amongst communities of many different types. In New York City, as I hope we'll be able to talk about a little bit more in question and answer, there was a long-standing, decades-long fight by communities, by litigators to challenge broken windows policing that resulted in unlawful stops and frisks of New Yorkers. multiple lawsuits were filed, and a large, impressive coalition called Communities United for Police Reform was brought together to help give voice to the concerns of Black and Brown communities throughout the city, that policing was not serving them, was not making them feel safer. And more recently, Muslim Americans and Muslim New Yorkers rose up against reports of illegal NYPD, New York Police Department surveillance against them in a targeted domestic surveillance program. And those two groups could have said, our fights are different, they shouldn't be united. And actually, instead, they took a different approach. People in the Muslim community, people in Black and Brown communities actually said, in a united voice, bias policing against any one of our groups is bias policing against all. And this is not the policing we want in the city. That unification has led to collaboration and strategies that have literally changed the face of the kind of civilian oversight of policing that's happening in New York right now. I think this kind of area is ripe for that kind of coalition building, that kind of intersectionality, and it's impressive to follow the lead of what folks in New York have done in other places across the country.
Thank you so much for your remarks, Nusrat. Next we have Janae Bonsu from BYP 100.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for having me for this very important conversation. Again, I'm from BYP 100, and just generally to introduce the organization, we are made up of 18 to 35-year-old Black activists and organizers that's really dedicated to liberation in all realms, social, political, economic, and educational. And we work towards our freedom dreams through really bridging grassroots direct action organizing and policy development and advocacy, electoral organizing and political education together in transformative campaigns. And so as we are an organization that is made up of all young Black, most of us queer, a lot of us trans, just really comprised of various marginalized identities, anti-criminalization work has to be at the crux of what we do. And so that includes resisting broken windows policing, right? And so we know generally broken windows policing is a theory of policing that suggests that aggressively policing petty crimes like turnstile jumping or panhandling, minor drug possession, that policing those things will maintain a sense of law and order in the community and in turn will prevent more serious crimes in that community, right? But that's just not true, and we've been resisting that in all of our chapters. We're a national organization with 8 chapters and growing. I can't possibly talk about all of the work that we're doing across the country, but I'll speak specifically to, in New York City, for example, they're really actively engaged in this Swipe It Forward movement, which is really to dismantle broken windows policing, since we know that fair beating is the #1 cause of arrest in the city, and we know that the people targeted are primarily Black and other people of color. And so one of the rallying mantras of the campaign is that poverty is not a crime, and it's not illegal to accept a swipe from your fellow New Yorker. And so it really highlights that broken windows policing isn't about reducing crime, it's about assuaging white fear of poor people, Black people, trans people, people of color, no matter how irrational or racialized that is. I'm based in Chicago, and we are really engaged in what we're calling the expanded sanctuary campaign. There's been a lot of discourse around the issue of sanctuary, especially in the advent of Trump's executive orders that are threatening funding to sanctuary cities. But the expanded sanctuary campaign really hones in on how police contact is the gateway that funnels undocumented immigrants into the deportation machine, but also whether you're undocumented or U.S. born, how police is also the gateway into the mass criminalization and incarceration machine. And really, in no city can be a sanctuary if racialized policing is not addressed, right? And so it's an issue of linked fate that goes beyond undocumented immigrants and also goes beyond policy solutions. And so we're really trying to highlight why and how we must rethink safety and implement the broadest protections from Trump's policies, which aren't, of course, new. We've been seeing mass deportations and mass incarceration long before January 2017. But this administration is focusing or refocusing on law and order, meaning increased policing and immigration enforcement, seeking to incarcerate and intimidate and detain members of Black and brown communities. And so key to our resistance has been growing relationships with other organizations based on our values to increase our power and really model solidarity beyond the buzzword. You know, really recognizing that, you know, we all want to feel safe. We all want to be able to rely on each other and not on an institution that is inherently racist, transphobic, and just overall oppressive to our communities, right? And so a part of that fight has been policy advocacy to decriminalize and repeal crimes of survival, eliminate gang databases that are really used to as a mechanism of predictive policing and isn't accurate at all. And really just overall narrative building and awareness raising through tactics like train takeovers and street teams, social media campaigns, cop watching, and beyond policy, we've been working towards modeling sanctuary spaces. So, you know, if we were able to pass city ordinances or state laws or at whatever level of government, that still in and of itself won't create the holistic sanctuary spaces or safe spaces that we need. We also need, you know, bystander intervention, block by block networks of people that can rely on each other. You know, harm-free zones, safety zones. So those are some of the things that we're trying to model and implement. Meanwhile, still challenging the state, challenging the institution of racist policing that criminalizes us on a daily basis. And so I'm really looking forward to talking more about what some of those challenges are in our Q&A.
Thank you for your remarks, Janae. Now we have Julie Fisher-Ralph on the Opportunity Agenda.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us today. I have just 5 tips for talking about this issue to various audiences, but to really try to clarify the narrative and get the messages out about the solutions that we would like instead of so-called broken windows policing. So the first thing to think about is when opportunities arise in policing, which they often do, and depending upon your own bandwidth and your own resources, to really be strategic in thinking about how to engage. So what are the goals of the communication? Who are the audiences that you want to influence, and what do you need them to do? Is this opportunity the one that's going to break your voice through and really allow you to tell your story in a way that's going to move those audiences forward? Because again, we're all faced with so many different things, and there's a temptation and sometimes pressure to respond to everything that comes up. But really being thoughtful and strategic can be a great way to really allocate your resources and your energy in a way that's going to make a difference. Next slide, please. The next tip idea is to lead with values when talking about policing in general, to really peel it back. There's so many details involved, there's so many policies and just smaller pieces that we tend to focus on, but how do we peel it back to the values that we really want to talk about? We really want to talk about equal justice, the fact that what you look like, the accent you have, how much money you make, where you come from should never affect the way that you're treated in our justice system. And the current disparities in the application of our laws violate that value. That we have founding principles that protect our rights, and we haven't always lived up to them, but they're an important place to start. We all have basic and human rights, guarantee of dignity and fairness that we deserve just by the virtue of our humanity. That voice that we all deserve a voice in decisions that affect us. And this goes hand in hand with community, that we need to live in places that hear us, that care about us, where we care for each other, pay attention to each other, and respect each other's rights. And finally, that redefinition of safety and security. What does safety really mean in a community? It means being able to trust police, not being afraid of being harassed by police. It means really making sure that everything is in place that ensures that safety can happen, so that people are cared for in a way that makes sure that they are feeling safe all the time. To make sure that safety means everybody and not just a few people who tend to rely on that for harmful narratives in the discourse currently. Next slide, please. To frame the problem carefully, and that the problem is an oversized, outdated police force that's relying on outdated policies that we know don't work. And so really saying that the problem isn't this one instance or that instance, it's really the systemic level of taking a look at what we need from police, what we need to maintain safety in our communities, and what does that mean. Next slide, please. And then going very quickly to solutions, that we need to focus on the right responsibilities for police to limit negative contact, to assign the appropriate roles. Police should not be the front line for mental health issues, for people who are experiencing homelessness, for people who are in other situations. There are other resources that as communities we can be more responsible in providing, and not putting that on police when we know that often when they are charged with that, it does not end well at all for any of us. So making sure that we have appropriate roles, making sure that people understand that data and transparency are so important in fully understanding what the police are doing and the impact of their actions. Making sure that we tell people what works, that we're not just focused on a problem all the time, because people have a lot of problems already in their lives that they're aware of, and if we don't give them ideas that we know how to move forward, they do tend to just shut us off and start ignoring us. So what works and what has worked elsewhere, and what is a better alternative to so-called broken windows policing? And to move beyond denouncing and move beyond just saying what is always wrong with police. We know that there's a litany of things that are wrong with police actions. Where are some places where things are going right? So it doesn't look like we're against having police full force all the time, but rather knowing that there are appropriate roles, appropriate places where police fulfill their role appropriately and well. What does that look like? Next slide, please. And finally, to build a message that moves people towards action. If you could just go through the slide, open it up, thank you. So again, to lead with values, to be inspirational and forward-looking, tell your audience why they should care. They should care because this is about our deeply held values, how we treat people in this country, and it's not happening, and we have a responsibility to change it. Next, please. To again outline the problem as a threat to values. This outsized police force is violating people's rights. It's outdated, and it's not pushing us in the direction that we want to go. Next, please. To be rigorously solution-oriented, tell people what works, tell people what the appropriate role for police is, but always to have that solution in mind so people will keep listening to us. And finally, to move audiences to action, to move to actually be influencing people is hopefully influencing them to want to make a change in the world. So finding a way to move through a message so that at the end they are primed for action. Thank you.
Thanks, Julie. Thanks for your insightful remarks. So we're going to turn now to the panel discussion, and I'm going to ask you a few questions about broken windows policing to all of the speakers and how you're working to counter the narrative around broken windows policing and redefining community safety. And the first question I have for all of you is whether you have any thoughts about how advocates can respond to the challenges in dealing with and talking about broken windows policing, and are there particular tactics that you found actually work? So we'll start with you first, Nusrat.
Sure. I think that broken windows policing is best addressed by advocates that frame it in terms of the impact on their community. So in New York, what was truly effective was this idea of bias policing, that whatever the intended goals of this policing strategy were, on the ground it actually looks really different. And what it has been leading to, or was leading to prior to recent reforms, was the stopping of people because of how they looked, their last names, and their faith. And that was true across Black, Latino, and Muslim communities. Similarly, in Milwaukee, what community advocates are saying, what the ACLU is saying, is that broken windows, which started in 2008, is leading to bias policing and widespread unlawful stops and frisks that treat people not based on evidence of wrongdoing, but treat them as the targets of police stops because of who they are and how they look. And I think boiling it down into those kind of basic terms has been helpful.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And Janae, you mentioned a few tactics that you've adopted to, really ensure that we're expanding how we think about what sanctuary means, and, using it as a concept that also applies to the way that different communities are policed. Have you found that particular tactics are very effective at getting reform or getting people to start talking about the issue in a way that you think is helpful?
Yeah, so one of the tactics that I mentioned earlier was what in the realm of awareness raising and starting dialogue and really getting people to not just care about the issue, but just be fully aware of what's going on. How we approach popular political education is really like going to where people are. So one thing that has been really helpful is what we call train takeovers and street teams. And so really it's like riding the trains with people and having conversations about how we're impacted by various tactics of CPD in my case, because I'm in Chicago, and what can be done, really plugging people in. How can they get involved with, if not us, then other organizations that are working towards, whether it's decriminalizing, whether it's whatever the particular demands of said campaign are, but really just going to where people are and including folks in conversations, because webinars, panels, conferences, they are not always accessible to the people that we're talking about or that are most directly impacted, and so really being creative about ways to be as accessible as possible when discussing these issues, and more importantly in coming up with solutions, because those who are closest to the problem are closest to the solutions, right? And so we really try to hold that close in resisting broken windows policing and criminalization broadly.
And Melissa, have you found that there are particular tactics that have been effective for you as you're working with sex workers and working with a community that is, considered to be more vulnerable?
Hi, I think for at least what I've seen is sort of more effectiveness in dealing with prosecutors and judges in terms of law enforcement rather than police directly. I think we've had a fair amount of success in being able to vacate people's convictions. That's a big thing that I work on, to vacate convictions of survivors of human trafficking. And it's a great remedy, but the problem is that it's after the fact. So while I would say it's a great sort of tool to have, to be able to go back to a court and petition them and talk to prosecutors and say, look, you criminalize this person for disorderly or prostitution or loitering, whatever ridiculous thing pursuant to broken windows, and you shouldn't have done that. And we've had success in vacating, but again, that's a very particular, specific remedy to survivors of trafficking that, again, happens after much of the harm has already been done. But that's sort of what comes to mind that we've had a lot of success in doing, but it's certainly not something that's, I guess, a broader scale success model that can be replicated, if that makes sense.
No, that's really helpful. And Julie, actually, I have a question for you. How can advocates remain visionary and, articulate values about how they want policing to change and what it should look like or whether there should be policing without resorting to myth busting or repeating, misinformation, especially in a time when folks themselves are dealing with alternative facts or misleading information in the news? How do advocates continue to remain visionary in this environment?
Yeah, thanks. That's a great question. And, the point about myth busting can't be overstated. I mean, when we are facing, so-called alternative facts, what are actually lies, lots of misinformation, misdirection, there is a temptation to respond to all of it, right, to tell people what the truth is. And we do need to get the truth out there, but we need to do it in a less defensive way, because when we do respond by repeating the misinformation, there's a lot of research that shows that misinformation just goes deeper into our audience's head. So you say it's not true that XYZ, they're much more likely to remember XYZ because now they've heard it several times, both by your opponents and by yourself. So finding a way to tell the truth in an affirmative way, to say what's true about our communities, what's true about safety in our communities, what's true about policing in our communities are these things. To pivot from the misinformation to the truth, and to keep that positive vision out there, to always take a couple steps back or take a moment to think, what is the long-term goal that I want to get across, and how does all of this lead up to that, can be helpful in just telling a long-term memorable story that then sticks with audiences and helps them understand all the different solutions that you're trying to get across, because they have context and they have a bigger picture, and it all fills in more than just handing them detail by detail at a time.
Thank you. That's really helpful in terms of ensuring that we're not just repeating, the opposition's myths and their lies, but actually telling, our story. Now, my next question is for both Nusrat and Janae, and you've both spoken about, opportunities for collaborating around this issue. And I know, Janae, you've been doing some work with Mi Gente. Nusrat, you mentioned a situation in New York around stop and frisk. I'm hoping that you guys can spend a little bit more time talking about the nature of these collaborations, how they came into being, and then also, whether you see opportunities for future collaborations and ways to ensure that, people working together against this particular type of policing. So we can start with you, Janae.
Sure, yeah. So VYP 100 has been working a lot with Mi Gente and in Chicago, organized communities against deportation, Arab American Action Network, really organizations that work at the intersection of anti-criminalization, anti-deportation, and share our values of the importance of radical inclusivity and intersectionality, and are committed to anti-blackness and just really centering the most marginalized in our work. And so we have found that particularly in this political moment, there's too much at stake for solidarity to just be a buzzword. And so that doesn't mean that we are in total, complete political alignment with everyone that we work with. There will be some slight or misunderstandings or whatever the case is along the way, but that shouldn't prohibit us from fighting for each other's lives, our rights, our privileges. And so we've really taken the stance of being co-conspirators because we have a linked fate. And so that's been showing up, or we've been doing that by showing up for each other, one, whether it's an action that we have or whatever, but also strategizing together, really getting in the same room on a consistent basis to, one, deepen our relationships with each other, because the first thing I learned about organizing is the importance of relationships. You have to be able to know what each other's self-interests are, what's your stake in the game, and be able to trust each other in order to throw down with each other, right? So we've been growing those relationships, strategizing together, leveraging each other's bases to move our power forward, So for example, in Chicago, our sanctuary city bill is called the Welcoming City Ordinance, and it contains currently contains loopholes of protections that exclude people who are alleged gang members or have had contact with the criminal justice system. And there's been sort of a divide between the Black caucus and the Latino caucus in the Chicago City Council. And so given that Organized Communities Against Deportations, for example, is organization of Latinx undocumented people, while BYP 100 is Black-led organization, we've been trying to have meetings with the BYP 100 having meeting with the Latino caucus and OCAD with the Black caucus to really say, hey, if you care about our issues, then you should care about the other, because they're intertwined and they're synced in these ways. So really being intentional and strategic about what cross-racial, cross-movement, cross-issue organizing looks like for a broader, more expansive vision of sanctuary and safety.
Thank you, Janae.
Hi,
and Nusrat?
Yeah, those were really great comments, and I really support what Janae is saying. I think that collaboration happens along two lines, and I think Janae touched on both of these in different ways. I think the first has to do with collaboration against bias policing, and particularly this morphed, mutated version of broken windows policing that we're seeing on the ground across race, ethnicity, and religious lines. And that is part of what I alluded to happened in New York. And there's also collaboration happening across different areas of focus and skills. So organizations and community groups that are focusing more on organizing and politics or legislative strategies with other folks that may be focusing more on litigation and those strategies. Collaborations, they absolutely have to happen on both levels. And I think part of what facilitates that collaboration is these shared values and these shared ways of talking about what the problem is and what those common solutions might be, even though there may be differences, and there will be differences, and that's fine. Like, these groups are different, and they're all valuable, and they're all bringing something to the table, and there are different ways of proceeding, but those commonalities are where the strength comes. So talking a little bit more about that collaboration across kind of identity areas and community identities along the lines of race, ethnicity, and religion, what we really saw in 2013 in New York was this series of somewhat difficult conversations between folks in Black and Latino communities, community organizers, litigators who've been challenging stop and frisk and broken windows policing for years, and having conversations with Muslims in New York who realized through a highly publicized series of Associated Press articles that they were being surveilled and targeted for being followed by informants in mosques, being mapped. NYPD was mapping Muslims where they ate and prayed and worked and lived, and sending informants into their communities to try to collect information, and it was all being done on the basis of their religious practice, which is unconstitutional. And those communities and those organizations, consisting of many, many, many people, had many, many conversations. And ultimately, there was an understanding that the bias policing happening in both realms, whether it was everyday routine stops, broken windows type policing, or it was targeting mosques and Muslim businesses and residential areas for informants, they were all wrong. That was very powerful. And just to end a little bit more, to talk a little bit more about this collaboration along lines of strategies, I think that what I'm seeing and I work, hearing and learning from the people that I work with is that every skill set needs to come to the table and bring their resources to bear to challenge bias policing. That is clear. There is no one strategy or solution that works. Community organizing is so powerful. Litigation can be a lever to help foster that community organizing and bring about change. But together, they are so much more powerful, and having that kind of mutual respect, those relationships and trust that Janae had alluded to is so important in bringing the full panoply of tools to bear against what is such a huge problem.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I think you're both right that collaboration is going to be very important, especially as we move forward and with the challenges that we're facing in this current political climate. Melissa, I have a question for you, and you touched on your experience in terms of the work you've been doing with trans women who are sex workers and trans women who are also immigrants. And I was hoping that you could expand on that and speak about how they're being impacted, for one. And then the second part of my question is, whether you think there are additional bridges that need to be built in terms of, connecting with different communities. Do you feel like the community that you're working with is as connected with, other movements that are happening right now?
Those are really important questions. I think, so specifically around trans sex workers who are also immigrants, we work very closely at the Sex Workers Project with the trans Latina community in Queens. I mean the trans Latina community generally, but certainly there's a large community in Queens that we work with. And what we see, and almost in terms of your first question, how they're impacted, I would almost parse that out maybe in broken windows and then now with Trump, right, and the current discourse and dialogue that's happening and impact. Well, the first thing is around broken windows policing. What we've seen time and again is that our clients are being targeted just for walking out the door of their house. So, something that people have termed walking while trans, right, is this idea that, someone can be leaving their house to go get milk and they're stopped and arrested for loitering for the purpose of engaging in a prostitution offense. And the reason for that is that particular crime, which it's absurd that it is a crime, but it is, is written in such a broad way that it gives police complete discretion to stop somebody who they think looks like a prostitute, right, or is in a high prostitution area. And, for our transgender sex workers of color, right, so immigrant transgender sex workers, they sort of check off numerous boxes that the police can say, aha, yes, oh, they're in a high crime area, they're walking at night, they are wearing, I don't know, something that looks like a prostitute wear, which again is absurd. And so with broken windows and this enactment of these, of constant arrests of these minor offenses, we see our trans immigrant sex workers routinely arrested for, again, going out and just trying to go visit a friend or buy milk or go dancing with friends. It's assumed that, it's that they're doing prostitution, and because they are such a marginalized community, police know that they can get away with those ridiculous arrests. They know that people are not going to fight back, or they knew most of the time that's certainly not going to happen. And the second piece, the second, I would say part B of your first question is now in the Trump era, where the sort of immigration consequences are so feeling so much more overwhelming for people who are not citizens, and even for some people who are citizens, right, who fit a certain profile, that people could even be afraid to walk out of their house to go get that carton of milk, right, for fear that it could lead to arrests. And that's incredibly dangerous. So in terms of your second question, what bridges need to be built, one thing that stands out for me when talking about transgender sex workers and trans survivors of human trafficking, one big bridge that really needs to be built is with what I would call sort of more mainstream feminists, or carceral, the more negative way maybe of looking at carceral feminists or second wave feminists, who are working with victims of trafficking but might not see transgender individuals as being victims because it doesn't fit their perfect little victim narrative of a little white girl with pigtails, right, being taken off the street and trafficked, which is not something that happens, or at least not something that I've ever seen in my practice happen. So, I think that's a big bridge that hopefully one day will be built because there's a lot of resources and money and power in that movement. and I also would love to see, more bridges being built between groups that are, led by other marginalized communities intersecting with the trans Latina community. I think that would be fantastic for, Black Lives Matter, for other groups to, to sort of intersect and connect with the trans Latina community.
Thank you so much, Melissa. So we're going to turn to audience questions, but I have a final question for you, Julie. And so Attorney General Jeff Sessions has a demonstrated interest in renewing the drug war, and I wanted to know if you have any thoughts about how advocates can prepare and get ahead of that narrative insofar as drug policy relates to policing. What are some things that advocates should be keeping in mind as that starts to happen?
Sure. So I think in thinking about this renewed, drug war narrative, first of all, there has not always been a lot of public support for that. People are starting to realize and have been realizing over time how ineffective that has been and how it has caused this over-incarceration and a number of different inequalities in the way people are treated by police. And so I think that building on that strength and building on that narrative, continuing to flesh out that bigger picture of what actually works in trying to counter any of the negative effects of drugs that may exist, what actually works in doing that, what works to make our communities safer, what we actually need to be focusing on instead of, countering drugs. All of those things, I think, really building on that positive arc is going to be really important, and then bringing that back to, taking that, okay, we know that there's been negative effects on the incarceration rates. We know that there's been negative effects on, differences in the way that people of color have been treated. So that obviously has something to do with policing as well, and tying that into how the war on drugs has led to really negative effects in policing, I think will be really important. But just keeping that positive story moving forward instead of, kind of going into the temptation of just fighting every little thing that he's going to be saying as it comes along, but instead laying out this bigger story that I think is going to be important over the long term.
Thank you for that, Julie. So we're going to turn to audience question, and one question that we've seen repeat itself a couple of times for the panelists is whether you have any suggestions for how to adapt some of the strategies that we've spoken about during the course of this conversation for advocates and activists who aren't working in major cities like New York or Chicago. So say someone who's working in a southern city or a smaller city or a town or a suburb whose law enforcement hasn't explicitly stated that they've adopted a broken window strategy, but in practice that's precisely what they're doing. So do you have any strategies for those advocates, and do you have any experience working in those types of communities? And that question is for any of the panelists who might have any remarks on that.
So I don't live sorry, this is Janae speaking. I don't live in a southern city or a rural town, so I can't speak from direct experience, but I can speak to some ways in which broken windows practices shows up in ways that are different than what we see in big cities. And so, like, I know community policing, for example, is a go-to reform in this time, and how basically community policing provides a political cover for aggressive enforcement of so-called quality of life crimes, and even for the physical displacement of people of color from gentrifying neighborhoods. And so, but I do think that the meetings, whether it takes place in through Black clubs or whatever, I'm not sure what that infrastructure is in southern cities, but could really be leveraged as a way to undermine their surveillance that really community policing seeks to legitimize. Instead of police encouraging neighborhood residents to report all strange license places or suspicious behavior, or descriptions of cars and people passing through the neighborhood. Really, I think a way to undermine that would be to create those bonds with other neighborhood residents to be able to rely on each other when something is wrong or amiss, instead of encouraging residents to call the police for any problem or minor issues that aren't inherently antisocial. And I know this also shows up in housing, particularly with like Black women, and what's sometimes called third-party policing, where there are attempts at crime control or prevention by activating people who are not necessarily sworn police officers. And one way that this is shown up is through nuisance ordinances, nuisance property ordinances, excuse me, that I know exist in many places, not just in large urban cities, where people are criminalized for being a nuisance property, whether it be domestic violence that currently or consistently happens in the place of residence, really breaks up families and contributes to homelessness. And so really at the crux of it all, I think, is just finding strategies to build bonds with other people in your community, and raise awareness of how criminalization is taking place, whether it is through broken windows policing, as we see in New York City, or if it's in other forms, and coming up with those solutions collectively.
Thanks, Janae. And I believe, Noose, you had a remark that you wanted to share. We're actually close to time right now, but I'll give you a few moments to share your experience.
Yeah, I think Janae just hit it right on the head. I think every city is different, especially in the South, in terms of how community organizing is happening and where those conversations are. So even if there isn't an existing formal infrastructure for community groups to come together and have conversations with the police, those can start by plugging into existing networks, whether it's through churches, through schools, those kinds of centers, to just have listening sessions to hear about what people in the community are saying are their experiences. And from those conversations can arise strategies for what to unite around. And I think the question is such a great one, because broken windows policing is a term that's used in certain cities by policymakers. And the terms can be different in different places. What ultimately matters is how human beings feel when they're encountered by police in their communities, whether they feel that those encounters are in fact promoting public safety and addressing real threats, or whether they feel like they're being targeted for some reason that doesn't make sense, like their race, their ethnicity, or their religion.
Thank you so much for that, Nusrat. This is a great discussion, but it looks like we're out of time now. But feel free to join the conversation on Twitter following the hashtag UnbreakableCJ. Thanks again to Melissa, Nusrat, Janae, and Julie for sharing their knowledge with us today. We have additional resources about talking about broken windows policing on transformingthesystem.org. A criminal justice report that is interactive. Thank you to the Opportunity Agenda staff who made today's webinar a success, especially Elizabeth Johnson and Jamila Brown. If you have any questions about today's material, please feel free to reach out to me or Elizabeth Johnson. We will send a link with a recording of the webinar and other materials as a follow-up so you can share that with your colleagues who couldn't make it today. As you close out of GoToWebinar, a short evaluation will pop up. Please fill out this evaluation so we can make sure we're offering the best possible content to partners in the future. Thank you again, and have a great day.